Yeah, yeah, we got a Daily Solutions podcast here.
Okay, welcome. So we have a good question today,
All right.
which is how do you set the temperature in your float tank so that it's comfortable for all of your floaters?
Jesus. Okay. This is probably like the most frustrating thing about running a floating center, as far as I'm concerned, is getting the temperature right. Because it's really like, it's not like light and sound, right? With light, there is complete darkness, and it just is dark, and there's a maximum darkness you can achieve. And with sound, there is like a maximum quiet you can achieve.
I mean, but that's true too. Like sound is also a very challenging one to get to.
It's challenging.
I don't think any float center gets to absolute quiet.
Sure, but at least the goal is the same, right? Like you're trying to hit an endpoint that's ubiquitous for everybody. But with temperature, it's not like that, right? Like if you have the perfect temperature for one person, it's not going to be the perfect temperature for the next person. And that's the part to me that's really frustrating about it. Like unlike everything else we're trying to control, where you can just move closer and closer to some sort of, abstract perfection that's out there somewhere. With temperature, it doesn't work like that. Like there is not a human temperature that every single person is going to find perfect.
Yeah, and even the kind of accepted average human body temperature, or what we put in to a lot of our float tank literature, ends up being 93.5 degrees. And I know float centers that keep their float tanks more at 94 degrees, for example, or 94.2, or more in the 93.4 range, or, it kind of varies a little bit across the board. And honestly, as far as I can tell, the temperature of 93.5 degrees just comes straight from John Lilly, and probably isn't necessarily our external average body temperature, but is in my opinion, more likely to be John Lilly's experimental body temperature that was just what he was comfortable at.
And there's like a million variables too, right? I mean, there's not only the temperature of the water, but there's how are you measuring the temperature of the water? Is it the built-in thermometer in your float tank? Are you using a reference thermometer? Where are you measuring it from? I mean, the whole body of water is probably not one single temperature, so where you're taking the measurement from differs. And then there's air temperature, right? So like that to me is a huge part of it that makes it very difficult to just say one number. Like you could have 93.5 degrees and no humidity in the air, and it would feel exceptionally colder than 93.5 degrees with an extremely humid environment like we find in float tanks. So that level of humidity that's changing and the temperature of the air that's changing, like all that factors into what it feels like temperature-wise to be in a float tank. So there's all those things going in, and then someone just comes out and says, I'm cold. And you're like, okay, like, do I need to change the water temperature or the air temperature or the humidity level or where I'm measuring my temperature from with my thermometer? Like, it's crazy. It's total madness.
So now that we've established that, once again, almost any question you ask us is going to be met with a huge nebulous form of answer because we don't actually really have concrete answers to a lot of these, let's go in and break it down a little more diligently here, I guess. So backing up, because what you said made a lot of sense to me. Even just how you're measuring the temperature has a huge impact on it. So let's start there. So we have in our tanks built-in thermometers that give us readings, usually on the controller, sometimes out in the lobby for our float tanks. And we pretty much don't trust these. And even if they're accurate, and even if you calibrate them when you get your float tanks, these can get off. And just trusting blindly what your float tank is shooting back at you, I think, is not always the best solution. Cheapest things in the world. And they're around a lot of salt water, so you can get ones that are made for dipping in water and have a really long cord on them. But I'd say, at least once or twice a year, we still have to send in our thermometers back to the manufacturer for repairs, just because.
More than that. Like, it feels like 4 times a year, maybe 4 or 5 times we're sending it in for repairs. We don't have to buy an entire new one, but we usually have to send it in and get like the probe part replaced or something.
Yep, and there's a lot of options out there. Specifically, we use ThermoWorks is the brand that we use for our thermometer. And yeah, it's a good lesson that any technology that you bring into your float center, even things that are made for wet environments, kind of have a life that's maybe not long for this world. So we actually check the temperature with those reference thermometers 3 times a day, I think is what our generator does. So that allows us to have this comparison point for making sure, A, that our temperatures are actually accurate, again, down to that 0.08 degrees, but also just that our readings coming out of the float tanks themselves aren't going haywire and freaking out.
And even that is still not enough. Like probably definitely the most frequent complaint we get if we were to get complaints from customers is that they felt too cold or that they felt too hot. So like as far as I'm concerned, we just don't have the technology yet to really have every person have a very comfortable float. And, in addition to like the humidity and all the other stuff I said, just people run differently, right? Like people run warmer or colder than other people, and people run different temperatures than themselves. Like if someone comes in the morning, or if they come in at night, or if they just worked out, or if they just ate food, like all these things change your perception. We've even found that people taking warmer or colder showers before they hop into the float tank will change their perception of how hot or cold it was in there. So there's, at the end of the day, like it feels much more like we have a handful of heuristics to try to deal with this, rather than kind of any like technological or systematic approach.
Yeah, and even it gets down to being as subjective as what you ate for breakfast this morning, or how active you were before coming into float. I know that if I go for a jog and go into float, everything is just way too hot, and I have to have the door wide open, take a really cold shower before I get inside, and it still feels just like really warm and way too muggy when I get inside there. Versus normally, I actually need to turn down the temperature on the tanks anyway a little bit, but I don't nearly get as overwhelmed with that. I remember we had a bricklayer who was coming in to float with us, and he'd just get off his crazy 8-9 hour days of laying bricks and would come in, and he would have to have the temperature way turned up because his body was running so warm from all the physical exertion that if it was at the regular temperature, he felt like it was almost ice cold or something, just because his own core was so hot, which is interesting.
Yeah, so what do we do in practice to deal with this?
I still like our idea of the stickers that we put on the wall that don't actually do anything, so that when people push them, they think that they're raising and lowering the temperatures themselves, but they're actually just pushing stickers.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of it that's just control, like feeling cold in there and not being able to do anything about it, I think is just an uncomfortable experience, So even the perception of like doing something to get your tank warmer. And this is from like, so one thing that we do is we put notes on people's accounts. So they'll come in, they'll say that they're a little bit cold. And
that's the real answer, although the sticker, I think, is the future solution.
But I mean, even with putting notes on people's accounts, like all the people come back in and I'll forget to do it. Like I won't turn the tank up. Like I won't see the note until after they float or something like that. And they'll come out after they float and they'll be like, thank you, that was perfect that time. Like, thanks so much for turning it up. And I'm just like, yeah, no, no problem. But that's part of it, right? Like trying to turn it up. And when we're talking about turning it up or turning it down, we're talking about, fractions of a degree here. So like nothing crazy. Like usually if someone says they want to turn it up the first time, I'll turn it up like 0.3 of a degree or something like that, maybe 0.4 of a degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really rare actually that we even get to the point where we need to raise it a full degree for people. That's how slim that margin of error is. If you get it off by 0.5 degree, or it's just 0.5 degree going the wrong direction for someone, all of a sudden it's way too warm for them, or it's way too cold. And yeah, I guess just to summarize and drive the point home that we've been saying this whole time, there is no perfect setting for the float tanks. And no matter how good you get it, no matter how much you're measuring with reference thermometers, ultimately it's just going to come down to, it's going to be one of the complaints that you get the most. And having a good system like notes on people's accounts and making sure that your staff are trained up to actually go in and really make those adjustments every single time ends up being really important, and can be the difference between having a regular customer who loves floating and having someone who thinks that all float tanks everywhere are slightly too cold for them and there's no way they'd go back in there.
Yeah, I feel like when it really comes down to it, there's three main things that we do. One is keeping the notes on people's account and adjusting it a little bit person to person. The second one is listening to feedback. Like if we get a bunch of complaints about people being cold or a bunch about people being hot, that's how we know to kind of slightly adjust things. And the third is seasonality. Like I just think that your tanks probably need to be a little bit warmer in the winter and a little bit cooler in the summer for probably a combination of reasons, like just the fact that everything is warmer and colder and your building is kind of warmer and colder in those months, as well as I think people tend to run warmer or colder. Like as winter descends, I think our bodies like adapt to it a little bit, and as the summer comes out, our bodies do too. So it's just like we're kind of in slightly different places in those seasons.
Is that just your feeling, or is that based on science? Or
I've read something. I feel like I've read. All right, I'll have to look this up more. But I was reading something on the internet not too long ago.
People listen to us, like we know, like what we're talking about.
This is what I'm saying. So there was something about the perception of heat and cold with the seasons, right? Like our skins actually like will adapt over the course of multiple days to different weather, which is why like the same temperature in the beginning of winter feels much colder than it does at the end of winter for us. Like your like skin actually like over the course of a short period of time will kind of like adapt to warmer or cooler weather. This is something I briefly skimmed on the internet.
It sounds very sciencey.
That's what I'm saying.
I believe you.
Yeah.
I believe you.
I believe me too. So that's pretty much that's good enough for me, I think.
All right. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. And now you know there is no actual perfect temperature in the float tanks.
Yeah. If you guys have any other questions you want to ask us, hop on to floattanksolutions.com/podcast. Have a good one.